Hi, everyone. This is Aaron Larson, executive editor of Power Magazine, and you're listening to the Power Podcast. On today's episode, I'm joined by Sean Kelly. Sean is the co-founder and CEO of Amperon. So, Sean, thanks for joining me. Please tell a little bit about yourself and your company.
Yeah, absolutely. So, as mentioned, Sean Kelly, I live in Houston, Texas, which is where I grew up, and then after making the rounds, ended up back here. Amperon provides AI-powered energy forecasts that help accelerate the energy transition. Started the company in 2018, and my background before that is I spent 11 years as a power trader. So I kind of only know how to do one thing, and that's play with power market. But now Amperon's positioned at the intersection of energy data and AI to deliver demand, renewable generation, and price forecasts to our customers, which is getting harder and harder, which is what we'll get into in a little bit.
Sure. For listeners that may not fully understand how power markets work, can you give kind of a brief overview of the process?
Absolutely. So electricity isn't like oil or gold. You can't just throw it in a warehouse and sell it later. It has to be produced and used in real time. I actually started my career on the real time desk where you would work 5:30 to 5:30, either AM to PM or PM to AM. And so that time we were balancing basically a giant seesaw. You had supply on one side and demand on the other. And if they don't stay balanced, the whole system can tip over, like we saw with Winter Storm Uri. I guess you get price spikes some of the time, and sometimes you get just full blackouts. Winter Storm Elliott over Christmas, a few Christmases ago, is another example. There's four basic pieces of this that I think are really important. The first being generation, right? Power's got to come from somewhere, and there's a lot of different players in the market. There's natural gas, there's wind, solar, nuclear. I was fortunate enough to be part of buying 9 Mile at Ginna and Calvert Cliffs from Constellation when I was at EDF, ran a couple other nukes. And there's even some coal, less in the United States, but a lot of other countries are extremely dependent on it. And then each has different costs and constraints. And that's why this whole process is a lot more difficult than it used to be, where you can say, this is what natural gas is and times the heat rate of how efficient the power plant runs. So that's generation. Next is transmission and distribution, which if you're really nerdy, you'll hear called like TDSP. Once generated, the electricity's got to go somewhere, right? We don't all live by power plants, thankfully. And so you've got these high voltage highways, which are transmission lines, and then they get off at these local roads, which are distribution networks to reach these homes and businesses. So this is what you see outside. This is a network that's really 100 years old, and that's what we're having a lot of issues with living in the middle of Houston. I definitely lost power for a week in May and a week in July due to power lines falling down and some vegetation management done poorly. So next step, we'll dive into market operation. In competitive markets, power isn't just generated and used, it's traded. So this is where you have the ISOs, independent system operators, and RTOs, regional transmission organizations, where they act like referees running these auctions where generators bid in and demand goes in and bid in as well. And then lastly, we get to the demand and forecasting, which is really where Amperon makes its home. And that's getting harder and harder every day. That's why AI matters, because this can't be done in Excel spreadsheets anymore, because wind does what it wants. Solar's a little more predictable, but still does what it wants. And then you see all of these crazy weather events happen all the time.
As you mentioned, Amperon is using AI to do this market forecasting. From what I understand, you're helping customers kind of track and plan and optimize their energy. Why is that so important today for your customers?
Yeah, because it's getting a lot more confusing. And it's getting a lot more confusing because EVs are great. I have a Tesla Model Y that I absolutely love, but my house doesn't look like it did before I bought it because we charge it at night every probably 3 days. And that's not the off peak that they thought I signed up for when we moved into the house. And like PV, rooftop solar, makes things a lot more interesting. You've got some states that have even pushed people really toward heat pumps, and even from electric heating before that using gas heating. So all of these things definitely change. And then climate is getting crazy. I mean, we obviously talk a lot about climate change, and it's not just warming, it's also cooling. Winter Storm Uri, Winter Storm Elliott. We've had multiple events here in Houston this winter in terms of just like cold that we didn't see coming. And so it's making it extremely more difficult. And so the way that we used to forecast, I've been doing this since 2005, starting in the trading side right after I got out of Texas A&M. Excel spreadsheet was totally fine, but now we're literally running at Ampron 4 to 6 models behind the scenes with 5 different weather vendors that are running an ensemble each time. So as it gets more confusing, we've got to stay on top of that, and that's where machine learning really kicks in.
Hmm. And what are some of the biggest challenges that you face when you're trying to produce accurate projections?
Yeah, weather misses is really, really difficult. And then just bad data as well. I mean, you look at how data has changed. And so we used to have, I mean, growing up, the kind of dog chasing the meter maid, right? They'd come in and read your meter every few months. If you live in New York, maybe once a year. A lot of pretty entertaining Con Ed stories that way. And that data doesn't work because it just tells you what you did for the month. Now you have smart meters, which give you every 15 minutes. I can tell within a 15-minute window when you left your home and when you came back and when you're actually using most or when you run your pool pump and things of that nature. And so data is changing. It's getting better and better, but it's still not as intelligent as our phones, which can do really everything. And so those are some of the challenges that we see. And there's going to be more challenges coming up. We used to look at historical data, and then COVID happened and it changed everyone's historical data, right? If you were a commercial building, your usage during COVID doesn't make sense anymore. If you're at home and you started working from home, your profile changed completely. And so there's so many challenges that are changing. And I feel like every time I list off these challenges that a new one pops up 6 months later.
Hmm. You mentioned that, this used to be done on an Excel spreadsheet, and it probably worked okay at the time for the needs of the industry. But now you're using AI, and as you mentioned, you're seeing things changing probably daily from one site to another, making predictions even more difficult. Do you see this continuing to evolve, and how can it get even better?
Yeah, I think it's definitely going to continue to evolve. And like I said, they were on spreadsheets, but spreadsheets didn't have to deal with wind and solar. 90% of the solar here in Texas and the ERCOT market's been has shown up on the utility scale side in the last 4 years. That's massive. I mean, I remember when I was at Tenasca back in 2005 and I was scheduling power, I asked, what is this crazy schedule that you keep making me change? Like, I'm the day ahead scheduler. Why are you making me change this every hour? And they're like, Sean, that's wind. And I was like, it's what? And they're like, yeah, it's wind. And it was a 0.5 megawatt turbines like out in West Texas. I think it was Buffalo Gap. And you're just like, okay. And now we've got 15 megawatt wind turbines offshore in Europe. I mean, just these massive, I think the ones off Martha's Vineyard are 11 megawatts. And I mean, you've got 40 gigs, 40,000 megawatts of wind in Texas. You didn't need to worry about spreadsheets then. Like when before you had renewable generation, coal's really easy to figure out when it's going to run. Nukes are really easy to figure out when they're going to run. Natural gas, you push the red button, you just put in, is it a cold start, is it a warm start, is it a hot start, and then like you're good. So this intermittent generation is what's really, really changed this and made it more difficult. And then again, talking about the old school methods where you took the year prior, flipped it on its head, and then said, "Oh, okay, well, what you did in 2024 is probably what you're going to do in 2025." Yeah,
Yeah.
right. Not even close. And so we haven't even talked about batteries. Are those demand or are those gen? Well, they're both. Sometimes they charge and they're demand. Sometimes they disperse energy and then it's gen. So it's just getting more and more difficult. And that's the gap that we saw. If you look on our website, the first blog post is from July of 2018, and it's basically how the world is going down a path that's going to be really confusing for us to do the way we do it currently. And that thesis could not have been more correct. I mean, we hit the absolute bullseye on our thesis in 2018, which is one of the things that's made us successful as a company.
Yeah. Who is your customer?
Yeah, so the original thesis of Ampron was, hey, meter data is getting better. Smart meters are going to provide us a lot of really good data. And so we really started working with the retail energy providers. So retail energy providers are in 14 deregulated states. It's a lot of the Mid-Atlantic region and PJM, as well as Texas. And so I kind of joke that it's only 14 states, but it's probably enough electoral votes to win an election. And so those you get to choose your own electricity. And so those are who we targeted first because we knew it would be a shorter sales cycle than utilities. Next, we went after traders. Those are all my people. And just said, here's our forecast of demand, wind, and solar, us versus the ISO, or we launched in Europe versus the TSO. And that is a 15-day or 360-hour forecast. The reason it's 360 hours is that's how much weather data you get from like the European or the GFS, and then we update those forecasts every single hour. So those were the first two segments that we started with, and then we continued to move on. We've got many commercial and industrial clients, so big LNG facilities, big box retailers. We've also gone to munis and co-ops, so municipalities and cooperatives. They look like utilities, but they're for normally more rural towns. But there's 3,300 of them across the United States. Then we went to IPPs, independent power producers, which is anyone producing generation. Could be coal, could be nuclear, but a lot of them are wind and solar and battery. And then last, we did something a little different for startups is we really didn't pay attention to utilities for the first 5 years, and we're a little over 7 years old. And so now we have a couple dozen utility clients, but wanted to go to them after we had product market fit.
Mhm.
But that's one of the things I really appreciated about Ampron and what we've done here is just the fact that the diversification of customer is just been really good to not go all in on one thing. Is I mean, as we're seeing right now, there's a lot of uncertainty across the market. So not to be fully reliant on one customer base is really helps build a sustainable company.
So could you walk us through an example of like how home solar or changes in EV charging patterns would make the demand forecasting complex and difficult for a utility, for example?
Yeah, so it's extremely difficult for a utility because the duck curve is just wild. We see this in Australia. We worked with the Australian energy market operator early on, and they dip negative to negative $1,000 prices and then go up to like positive $15,000 prices per megawatt. And then when with that experience, when Texas started getting a lot of rooftop solar around like the 2020, we actually aggregated where I believe we have about 60% of all residential solar customers are on our platform via the retail energy provider. And so we help them just figure out what the duck curve is going to look like because we used to have on peak and off peak back in the day. So on peak being from 6 a.m. to 10 p.m. and then off peak being 10 p.m. to the following 6 a.m. That's how things used to trade. And those were on peak was expensive and off peak was less expensive. Now that doesn't work because you've got those middle hours of the day where there's a ton of sun and less demand. And so that's really what we're helping utilities, especially in California, with. I mean, we're also helping a number of retailers who deal with like really states with high solar penetration, like in Texas. And we're also helping CCAs, community choice aggregation, which kind of looks like the cross between a muni co-op and a retailer, but mostly specific to California.
And I know there are real world consequences to getting these demand forecasts wrong. I remember hearing stories about some of the rural electric cooperatives that ran up, huge bills during some of these winter storms when power prices spiked up to 5,000 or I think even 9,000 was the cap at the time. Can you explain how that affected them or how it could very well affect others in the future if they don't get the forecast right?
So Winter Storm Uri was definitely most near and dear to me personally. We lost power at our home for 72 hours. My wife was 6 months pregnant, so that was a little dicey. But our clients were very appreciative of the work we had at Ampron. We probably had, I don't know, a dozen or so clients at that time. And we told them on February 2nd that this was coming. So February 2nd of 2021, Valentine's weekend is when things got dicey. That February 13th is when prices started hitting really high. And then February 14th was a Sunday. We have a marketing department now, but I put out one of my personal favorite posts of good Valentine's Day ideas to do in the dark. And then at 2 a.m. on February 15th is when the grid went down for most of Texas. And so we told people because it went down on February 15th, and that's when it flatlined for 4 days at a $9,000 price cap. We told everyone on the 2nd of February, so they had so much time to get out in front of it. Like I said, our forecasts go out 15 days. ERCOT's forecasts only go out 7. They still only go out 7. So we told everyone, alert, alert, this is coming. Dr. Mark Shipham, our in-house meteorologist, was screaming it from the rooftops. So we had a lot of clients who bought $60 power per megawatt. So think about buying 60s and then your opportunity is 9,000. So a lot of traders made money. I mean, all LSCs, load serving entities, still got hit extremely bad, but they got hit a lot less bad. And I remember one client saying, I bought power at 60, then I bought it at 90, then I bought it at 130, then I bought it at 250 because you kept telling me that load was going up and that this was getting bad. And they're like, that is the best expensive power I've ever bought. I was able to keep my company as a retail energy provider. And so those are just some of the ways that these forecasts are extremely helpful. I mean, you look at what happened just now, only a few weeks ago here in Texas over President's Weekend. We actually were 1% off on the peak load 6 days prior. And so them knowing exactly what was coming 6 days prior, them being all of our over 120 customers, we're really, really thankful because getting it right the day before, most of the time the trade's already been done there. Getting it right 6 days in advance, that's what's really important. So I've got stories like this for days and days, but that's definitely the highest P&L impact.
Anecdotally, it seems that weather patterns have changed and that we're seeing much more volatility in how extreme storms are. Is that accurate in what you're seeing when you're developing your forecast? Have we gotten to a point where things are much more extreme and volatile?
Absolutely. I mean, early in my career, the only thing that we really worried about was hurricanes. I mean, all across everything, the eastern seaboard, I mean, definitely the Gulf of Mexico. It was really hurricanes because hurricanes would go and they would knock out all the offshore drilling that was going on in the Gulf of Mexico. It would cause natural gas prices to spike. Well, now we have hurricanes and there's very little drilling in the Gulf of Mexico. It's mostly fracking on land. And so it actually kills load because there's power outages. And so now gas prices go down. So the complete opposite. And then you have wildfires that obviously mess up the transmission and distribution, like we saw terribly in California, seen in Boulder, seen all these different locations that didn't historically have wildfire as an issue. We ran into a derecho. I'm a huge weather nerd. I have never heard of a derecho until these like 100-mile-per-hour winds came and ripped through Houston, and it only was a 30-minute event. And it wound up taking out, I mean, just power lines everywhere. The building that Wells Fargo and the Total building downtown got all of their windows shattered, and it literally was like a 30-45-minute event. Never heard of a derecho before. And then you're seeing these winter storms. We used to just be concerned about what the summer peak was going to be, and that's what everything traded July, August premium all across the board. And now we're actually more worried about what winter is going to look like in winter peak because so many people have switched to electric heat and we rely so much more on electricity for even our vehicles. So, I mean, everything is changing, and I really feel like we're having this 1 in 100 year event like every 3 months now, which is definitely not how it used to happen. We used to just have a hurricane every few years, and we still have hurricanes, but now we've just added all these other things and learned what a bomb cyclone was. Got stuck in South America when that hit the East Coast back a handful of years ago on New Year's Day. Like it's just you keep on hearing about these things. You're like, it's a what? I thought I knew weather pretty well, and so unfortunately, I think that this is going to just continue on and on.
Yeah. And you've shared a lot of examples already of how you've helped, avoid disasters or financial disasters for utilities in Texas. Are there places outside of that area, maybe California or some other location where you've also been able to minimize the financial problems that a utility face because of poor forecasts or not having accurate information?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I always get in trouble for quoting Texas because A, I live here, and B, that market just keeps getting hit and with the high price caps. But I think Winter Storm Elliott, which is when we had rolling blackouts on Christmas Eve, we were able to talk about that. We call that about a week out. So again, a lot of the munis and co-ops and even like traders that we dealt with across like PJM, like the Southeast, were able to get out ahead of that. And honestly, right after that happened, we had some talks that had kind of stalled with a couple of utilities. They came back and said, okay, we get it. We understand why this is so important because PJM had been pretty quiet for so many years. And then when that winter storm hit, it really made them kind of wake up because again, you can have rolling blackouts, but you can't do it on Christmas Eve. That's in the frowned upon category. And I mean, California, similar. I mean, you have these heat waves come and they really need to know it. I mean, not only that, but just from a safety issue, as a lot of people don't have air conditioning out there. So these extreme heat events, whether we're calling that directly, we have some. We're not a weather company, but we do provide access to a meteorologist who puts out a newsletter, and so we're able to kind of alert those in California and be like, "Hey, this is coming. This could be pretty bad." And so they're used a variety of ways. And then we launched last June in Europe. Europe just with the Russian gas crisis and the nuclear issues. And I mean, the weather getting more volatile and more people getting air conditioning, more people getting electric vehicles has really been top of mind. And so we've definitely already made some really big strides over there in the, I guess, 9 months that we've been active in that market.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned how the growth of renewables, from the early days of your trading experience to now has changed the way the market operates. As we continue to add more and more renewables, what do you think is going to happen to the market dynamics going forward?
So I really think everything is going to go binary. It's going to be a zero or it's going to be a one. And by that, I mean it's going to be a $10 power or it's going to be $1,000 power. And so, like I mentioned before, we used to have on peak and off peak, and now it's these middle hours that no one really wants to own. And so, if you're going and building solar, those are really hard hours to hedge and say, hey, I'd really love to sell you these hours. And people are like, not overly interested. Or when the sun goes down, if the wind goes down with it, those are the hours that we're so reliant on batteries because the batteries really have to show up and have that charge because if all the sun disappears at give or take like the same time every day, right? Depending on the season. And then if the wind happens to go with it, which happens often in shoulder season being kind of that spring fall where you're not used to having wild weather, normally also go and kind of fix and clean up your thermal plants then. And so normally you're having like tens of thousands of megawatts of outage. Those batteries are just kind of cleaning up on hour ending like 19, 20, 21, which is like 7 p.m., 8 p.m., 9 p.m. So that's really where a lot of this has changed. And so the correlation of what used to be on peak price is just it's much, much different. And I spoke about this on a panel 2 weeks ago. There need to be new products in the market. We need new products by one of the exchanges to come out to make people actually be able to properly hedge these new assets because again it's not old school baseload where your coal plant runs 24/7 or your nuke runs 24/7 or your combined cycle runs a minimum of 8 hours. All of that's changing, so it is I definitely think we need to have some new products to trade because of all these market dynamic changes.
Mm-hmm. And over the years that you've been doing this, which is quite, a couple decades here, what's the most surprising change that you've seen in how utilities are managing their generation and their trading?
that nothing's really changed in how they manage it. Our biggest incumbent with utilities, unfortunately, is a spreadsheet built by somebody 20 years ago. We're going to continue to see all of these problems with utilities. We're going to continue to see issues with how they manage climatic events. And the way utilities are incentive right now is to build more infrastructure. And that's not completely the answer. I'm definitely pro building more generation, more transmission, but we've also got to get smarter with what we have. As data centers are showing up and taking these load forecasts up, I mean, Georgia Power IRP kind of long-term planning is saying that it's going to be just massive load growth in the southeast. And I mean, Texas is saying the same, Virginia is saying the same. I mean, we're definitely going to have to get better than the spreadsheets that we have managed by somebody that were built 20 years ago, because they're going to break. They do break, but they still don't want to take the time to switch out to an AI driven forecast that can actually make decisions significantly better than a less flexible model can.
Mm-hmm. And you bring up a good point with the data centers. That seems to be the topic on everybody's mind for the past 6 or 8 months at least. What do you see, or how do you see data centers affecting or changing market dynamics going forward?
It's going to affect things a lot, but less than people expect. To break that comment up a little bit, is right now people are looking at what's in the queue to be built, and there's a lot of double counting. It may be the same site, and multiple private equity bidders or hyperscalers are kind of saying that this is mine and you can only build one there. Some people are saying that, like, hey, we might put it in Virginia or we might put it in Georgia. And I'm not going to build both. I only need one of them. And so there's a lot of double counting in the queue right now. So that's obviously going to take the number down that people are expecting. Because I think some people are kind of back on their heels, especially the ISOs, because load growth has been pretty flat for a really long time. And that's because, what were we talking about 10 years ago? We were talking about, or even 15 years ago, we were talking about energy efficiency. And guess what? LED lighting and things like that, and more efficient buildings that hold heating and cooling better, are going to continue to take down load. That was the thesis of the ISOs for a long time. And now this just showed up. And so I think that is where people are surprised and scared. And so I think the numbers that are being forecast out there are higher. There's also not, it's physically impossible with the amount of generation we have to build that many data centers. What I think data centers are going to be doing is becoming more flexible. And so they're going to become more flexible, and they're going to have to figure out how to kind of move the compute around. They're going to have to figure out how to be good stewards during the CP events, which are coincident peaks. Different ISOs have different, like one CP for MISO. It's called NSPL or PLC, and PJM for CP. And what that is it's like the highest, like 15-minute or 1 hour interval during a hot month or a cold month. And so they're going to have to learn to behave. So the data centers are coming. It's not going to be as bad as we expect, but I definitely think it's real, and it's going to change the way that we look at the grid. And it's going to also, the grid's going to have to change to make room for these.
All right. Well, thanks, Sean. This has been really interesting conversation. Is there anything that I haven't brought up that you think would be important to mention before we wrap up the podcast?
Change is not a bad thing. The world's changing. There's nothing that we can do to stop it, from a climate standpoint, from a generation standpoint, from a demand standpoint. But we've got to stay on top of the latest and greatest technology. And that's why we are always paying attention, updating our models, and just they retrain every single hour to get better and better to deal with all of that's coming down the pipe. This job is getting harder and harder by the day, both for the software companies, but really, really for those, especially the load serving entities. So that's where we've got to adopt new technologies and always continue to better ourselves, better our knowledge of the new things coming down the pipe, and just work together to make the grid a much more stable place, as electricity is not going anywhere anytime soon.
All right. Well, thank you again for listeners. I've been speaking with Sean Kelly, co-founder and CEO of Amperon. It's been a pleasure having you on the podcast, and I appreciate your insight.
Thanks for having me, Aaron.